Welcome to Train Signal. I'm Mel Haynes, and you're watching an introduction to SQL Server tools. In this module, in this video, I'm going to give you a bird's eye view of some of the tools that you installed when you installed SQL Server 2008. So if you went through my previous video where we walked through the installation process, this will give you a little hands-on with a few of the things you've put in place. So, AKA, like I said, this is the 50-cent tour of SQL Server 08. We're going to delve into a lot of these in a lot more detail in future videos. But for now, we want to look at things such as, what is the SQL Server 2008 Management Studio? We're going to play around with that one because I'm going to use it to actually load in a database, run some queries, and do a few simple things. So have some fun with that. Like I said, we're going to load a database, and we're going to actually load the Veronica's database. As we mentioned in one of the prior videos, we're going to be helping to support a fictional business known as Veronica's. And we're going to load a sample database in this chapter just to play around with the Management Studio. We'll also talk about the Business Intelligence Development Studio. Yes, there is such a thing as business intelligence, and there's a suite of products in SQL Server that help support business intelligence, or the ability to take massive amounts of information and get something useful out of it as opposed to just a lot of numbers. Give us what we need to make smart decisions for the company. So we'll talk about the tools that support that. We'll look at performance tools. How do you make SQL Server run faster? How do I get my results more quickly? What's bogging me down? What queries are getting me in trouble? There are performance tools that help you pinpoint those types of issues. Now, once again, we're not going to actually use the tool to pinpoint the issues at this point. For now, the focus is just, hey, here's what you've installed. Let's just kind of play around with it. Configuration Manager, I'll show you how to find that and some of the things you can do with the Configuration Manager. Reporting Services Manager is another tool we'll spend a little time looking at. And then last but not least, we'll just talk about command line tools. I'm not going to actually run any command line tools, but you can probably find the command line. Just go to the run and type CMD. You get a command line, and you can run command line tools. But just want to point out the fact that there are command line tools as well. And we do talk a little bit about PowerShell. So with that, let's actually jump over to my SQL Server box and start walking through some of these tools. Okay, so you survived the installation of SQL Server, and now we want to spend a little bit of time looking at what you got as a result of your installation. So I'm going to go to my Start button. If I go to All Programs, I see a few program groups there, actually 3 of them all highlighted in yellow, letting me know they're recently installed. The first one is my Microsoft SQL Server 2008 program group, as I would expect to see. The second 2, however, you wouldn't necessarily expect to see right off the bat, and that's a Visual Studio 08 and a PowerShell 1.0. But yes, all those came with SQL Server, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about all of those. I'm going to start with the first one, Microsoft SQL Server 08. Just kind of click there and expand it, and you got quite a few things to choose from, starting with an import and export data tool, which is pretty cool, for bringing information in from various data sources such as flat files. Next, SQL Server Business Intelligence Development Studio. Is there intelligence in the land of SQL Server? Let's click on it and find out. Well, that thing flashed on the screen really quick, partly because I've been in here once or twice before. The very first time it's a little slower to load, and you would have noticed something on the right-hand side of that splash screen where it lists SSIS, Integration Services, SSAS, Analysis Services, and SQL Server Reporting Services. Microsoft Visual Studio 2008 is the interface you're going to use for creating your SSIS, AS, and RS projects. Way cool. So for those of you who've come from the Visual Studio background, such as myself, you can get real excited now because yes, many of your skills will transfer over. Now we're going to get into using the Visual Studio 08 interface a little bit further down the path here. I wanted to start off just showing you a little bit of the ropes, just walking you around the environment. Starting with this wonderful news feed right here in the middle. It's kind of cool. Click here to enable an RSS feed that provides regular updated articles about new technologies, etc. from Microsoft, which can be pretty cool. I have not enabled that yet. Moving over to the right, I've got my Solution Explorer. Now, once again, those of you who've worked with the Visual Studio environment before, you're going to be real comfortable with that. If you haven't worked with Visual Studio before, no sweat. Solution Explorer is just the place. It's sort of like a Windows Explorer, where you use that to navigate the file system. The Solution Explorer is what you use to navigate a solution or a project, because a Visual Studio project is going to be made up of multiple components, lots of folders with files of various types inside of those folders, and the Solution Explorer will be the way you navigate that. Below the Solution Explorer, we have our Properties window. Clicking on the various properties, now I don't have any there right now, but clicking on the various properties, you can configure your solution. You can change parameters of the objects that are part of your Visual Studio project. Now, once again, this is just the nickel tour at this point. We're not going to spend any great amount of time inside of SQL Server's Visual Studio at this point, but I just wanted to get you a little bit more familiar, a little bit less intimidated by the environment. So I'll go ahead and close that down for now. And I'm going to mosey on over to my Start menu again, click on Start again, go back to All Programs, go back to that SQL group, and move on down the line. There's SQL Server Management Studio is next on the list. We are not going to click on that one yet. I know some of you probably just did if you're doing this while watching along. If you did, that's okay. Just minimize it. You can come back to it. But we're going to spend a little bit of time walking through that, since that's where we'll spend most of our time when we're working with SQL Server. So I want to come back to that. I'm going to go on down to Analysis Services. Once again, you've seen that term in a few different places. We just saw it on the BI splash screen. But here's the deployment wizard for your Analysis Services project. Configuration tools, lots of things to configure. There's your Reporting Services Configuration Manager, a SQL Server Configuration Manager. There's your Error and Usage Reporting Configuration tool. And remember the Installation Center we initially pulled up in order to install SQL Server? Well, if I click on that, there it is again. Because as you remember from the installation, of course you remember that, right? There were a lot of different tools in here for lots of different things. There's the installation portion, but there's also various maintenance things. Or we talked about adding a new server instance or SQL Server instance. So all that kind of stuff is easily accessible from right here. But I'm going to go back up a few on that list. And let's hit the SQL Server Configuration Manager as well. Go back there. Now I've been in here a few times before, so mine immediately defaulted to the last spot that I clicked the last time. Yours will probably look more like that. But if you click on the SQL Server Services, you will see exactly like the title says, and you can resize that to give it a little more space if yours isn't quite as visible as mine. But you'll see all the services that are part of SQL Server. Yes, SQL Server has a lot of little services running around in Windows. Well, actually, two of them currently aren't running because they're stopped. Notice this one is set to manual, means I have to manually start it every time. If I wanted to, I could right-click and start it, or I can go to Properties, and I can, here, if I go over here to Service, I can change the start mode from manual to disabled or automatic. Going back to Log On, remember during the installation, I gave an account that would be used by this service, and it would run with the privileges that I give to that particular account. And you may recall we did that using the administrator account. Here's where I could change that if I decide to update that, which you should do if you're in a production environment. You don't want the administrator account being used there. And I can use various other built-in accounts. So all those types of things can be modified from right here inside the SQL Server Configuration Manager. I will play around with this kind of stuff a little bit more going forward, but I just want to point it out once again so you can take pictures, take notes, and we'll come back and play with it in more details later. Going back to that same program group, there's documentation and tutorials, lots of those. Here's my books online. SQL Server Samples Overview. Clicking on that one actually brings up an HTML page. And notice here, codeplex.com. The SQL Server samples don't ship with the software these days, but you instead go to codeplex.com, and there you can download a myriad of, to use a not commonly used word, a myriad of SQL Server samples. So you'll have all the various sample databases, the various flavors of AdventureWorks, as well as other samples. So tons and tons of stuff. Many of the examples on the Microsoft website, the TechNet website, the MSDN website, they're based upon those databases. So if you want to be able to follow along with those samples, you'll want to download and install the AdventureWorks databases. Okay, so just wanted to point that out. Go ahead and close that down. Go back to my handy Start menu, go back to All Programs, and continue on looking at integration services, sort of like analysis services. You've got your data profile viewer, execution package utility, looking at performance tools. You got our database engine tuning advisor for getting the maximum mileage out of our SQL Server database. Our SQL Server profiler. I'm going to go ahead and click on the profiler. And voila, nothing, right? But if I go to the file menu, tell that I want a new trace, ask me to log into my database again. I'll go ahead and do that. Click connect. And it gives me, after a few basic questions, and I click run, a default trace of activity in my SQL Server database. Now, we'll get into this and talk about it in more detail later, but it's basically just building information as we go. The login name, the username there, just repopulate it with some new information about every 10 seconds or so. It'll do that. If I go to Tools and go to Performance Monitor, pull up another cool tool. Reliability and Performance Monitor, so I can track things such as the CPU performance, kind of like SQL Server's own task manager built inside here. My disk usage, network stuff going on, memory use, and then more information and more details down here at the bottom. So lots of tools for monitoring SQL Server and figuring out how to optimize its performance. Once again, I'm going to go ahead and close these down. Are you sure you want to close it? Yes. Moving on, going back to Start, All Programs, moving down to Visual Studio. Well, there's really not a whole lot to see. You've actually been in there when you went into the BI option, so it's really the same thing all over again. There's a few other tools as well. There's a remote debugger and some other debugging configuration tools. And then moving down to Windows PowerShell 1.0. We've got documents on it. If you click on documents, it brings you to the, in my case, the US version of the documentation. There's a full user guide there. But I'll get out of there. And the Power Tool itself, go ahead and start that up. It's kind of a command prompt-like window, but this is a place where, for those of you who are the hardcore geeks and don't want to deal with any stupid GUI interfaces, we would never say that to certain people, but here's your chance to go back to the old command line. Why would you ever want to do that? Well, there are benefits to doing things at the command line. You can create groups of commands and save them for reuse. Now, there's also features in SQL Server's GUI that allows you to do the same thing, but they have a PowerShell tool that allows you to script various administrative tasks that are part of SQL Server, as well as other Microsoft products that also use PowerShell. So it's a handy tool to get somewhat familiar with. So I want to point that out as well. I'll go ahead and close that down. You'll actually see PowerShell pop up in a few different places as an option on a few different menus as we're working through SQL Server. But that's kind of the high level 32,000 feet at 700 Knox version. I'm going to go back to SQL Server Management Studio because, like I said, that's going to be home base, so to speak, where we'll spend most of our time. And it's configuring itself for first time use. This may take a few minutes. Actually, it's more like about 45 seconds typically, but if it goes longer, we'll jump out of this. But there it goes in about 45 seconds or less. I have to log in again. And we've talked about this process at least once or twice, but there's the various services I can log into. There's the actual server. My current server is what it's defaulting to, or I could pick a different server. And then there's my authentication mode. You may recall there were basically two, Windows or SQL Server authentication. But I'm going to go ahead and click connect, just going straight in using my current account that I'm using under Windows. And after a few seconds of chugging along, my Object Explorer here on the right populates. And let's turn this off. Don't need to see that. So here on the left hand side, I've got my SQL Server Management Studio Object Explorer. Very first thing on the list is the server name again. And if I expand this first group, database group, I've got some folders inside, my system databases and database snapshots. I'll go ahead and expand my system databases and take a look at those. Currently I have 4 system databases listed here, and let's spend a little bit of time talking about those system databases. So let's move over to the slides And when we're done, we'll come back over here and play around with them a little more. So we looked at, I'm doing this a little backwards in that I'm showing you the actual software first and then showing you a picture second. I usually do it the other way around. I show you the picture first and then give you the real deal. But I wanted to back away from the product and just focus on these system databases for a little bit. Primarily because if you look at the Object Explorer, you don't get as broad a picture as I would like to give you. Specifically, you don't see the last one on the list there, my distribution database, which really is another system database. But I'll start at the top and we'll work our way down to that one. The master database. The master database is a database just like any other, but in some ways it's very different. The tables in the master database are actually tracking the server installation itself. SQL Server has information it needs to manage in order to keep track of the other databases, the user accounts, replication, anything you've configured in SQL Server has to be saved in some location. It's not typically using files. SQL Server is using databases to track its data. Now, some of the things I just threw out there, such as replication, that's not going to be in the master database. We're going to get to that a little bit later. But simple things such as user accounts, as well as what are the other databases that are available under this instance of SQL Server, that kind of stuff is going to be in your master database. So you probably are getting the feeling that the master database is absolutely critical to your system, and you're right. You definitely want to keep a current backup of your master database at all times. Anytime you do anything such as creating another database, changing configuration values, modifying login accounts, all of those make modifications to your master database. So after performing those activities, you definitely want to back up your master DB. Moving on to the model database. The model database is simply a template database. Once we get into creating databases, you'll notice there's some default values of that database, of that new database, that you can go ahead and configure any way you want to. Where do those default values come from? It's your model, which can be kind of handy. Let's say you want all databases to have certain user accounts the moment you create them. Put them in your model, create a new database, they'll always be there. So anytime you'd like every new database to start out with certain objects or permissions, you can put them in the model and all new databases will automatically inherit them. Pretty cool stuff, can save you some work. Moving on to TempDB, also known as the temporary database. It's basically like scratch paper for SQL Server, or maybe the Windows paging file is in some ways a similar concept. If it runs out of actual RAM, it pages things out to a physical location on the hard drive, a file. Now, SQL Server's TempDB is unique among all databases because anytime SQL Server is restarted, it's recreated, never recovered. You never go back and recreate the information that was in your scratch paper workspace. You don't need it. You only need it while SQL Server is performing some massive interaction that needs a temporary location. Or another case is when a user doing T-SQL statements creates temporary tables. Those are housed in TempDB. But once again, those are temporary tables. If you restart the server, those go away. They're not physically maintained. Now, if you want to actually physically maintain them, you don't create temporary tables. You say go ahead and create an actual physical table. Now, because of TempDB, which was added in SQL Server 7, your performance for insert statements can be up to 4 times faster, which is a really cool thing. So that's why we have TempDB. Moving on to the MSDB database. We won't be touching MSDB for a while, but the MSDB is used exclusively by SQL Server Agent Service. You may recall some comments I made about the SQL Server Agent Service. It's used for creating jobs that can automate various administrative tasks. And you can associate timers and calendars and users and all kinds of cool things with those jobs. When this job starts, notify Joe. If this job fails, notify Joe and Joe's boss. That kind of stuff can be set up with SQL Server Agent. You need a place to save that as well. You don't want to put it in the master. It's not a good place. You don't put it in the model because you don't want it to be in every database. That's definitely not temporary information. It gets its own DB, MSDB. Next, we have 2 others that I'll kind of lump together. Notice in the Object Explorer, they're not listed under System Tables, but you know, you can argue one way or another that maybe they are, maybe they aren't. You don't actually physically create those two databases. Those are automatically created by the system, which is why I put them on the same page, when you install Report Server. All we did was install Report Server, and SQL Server automatically created those two databases to support that service. So in some ways they are kind of like system databases, but they're specifically focused on Report Server. And then that brings us to the last database on the list, which is very much like Report Server. You don't currently see a distribution database in your system database list because we haven't installed, or shouldn't say install, we've installed it, but we haven't actually implemented replication. When you go and set up replication, which is the process of copying information from one database out to other databases so that users near that second database have a local copy, right? The moment you set that up, SQL Server manages that process in a database known as a distribution database. Now, interestingly, when you set up replication, SQL Server automatically creates your distribution database, and it will actually be inserted in the system databases folder. But I'm lumping all those together as your various system databases. So let's move back over to the actual SQL Server box and continue on. So here back on the SQL Server side of things, once again, there's my 4, and as I mentioned before, there are really about 5 or 6 databases that I would include as part of the system database list. There's these 4, the distribution database, as well as the Report Server and Report Server Temp DB, since those are all created by and used primarily by the system. So I'll go ahead and get out of that. Next, let's look at the security folder. I'm going to go ahead and expand that one out. Notice it says logons, server roles, credentials, audits, some of the kind of things you'd want to see under security. Now before I go any further there though, let's back up a little bit. I'm going to leave that open. Expand system databases again, expand my master database. Notice the master database has a security folder as well. Opening that up, it's got users and roles, right? As opposed to logins, right? There's some logins under that folder. There's some users under this folder. And notice you see some of the same things under both. Here, Mel's Domain Administrator is listed here. Mel's Domain Administrator is listed here. Now, we'll develop this a little bit further when we get into the security module, but I just want to point out you've got a security folder associated with each database, as well as a security folder associated with SQL Server, the server itself as well. Various server objects, such as your backup devices and endpoints for your communication, link servers, various triggers. There's a replication folder as well. Expand that one. We'll get into replication in one of the later videos, but this is where we get that additional system database from. Remember, we talked about that in the other slides a few seconds ago. The replication component will actually create an additional system database. And then moving on to the management group, expanding that one, some cool looking stuff. Policy management. We can create policies to manage one or more SQL servers, and you can start that process from right here. If I go to expand it, you can see things such as policies, conditions on those policies, and the various facets of those policies. Cool stuff, sort of like diamonds, right? Data collection tools, resource governor. We'll do some things with resource governor a little bit later. This allows you to create resource pools and then limit SQL Server processes to those pools so that they no longer can run rampant, taking up all of your resources. They can only take up as much as allocated to their particular pool. Pretty cool. Maintenance plans, another one of the features in SQL Server logs. Database mail feature. There's a lot of different mail features built in SQL Server. Distributed transaction coordinator, dealing with transactions that are dependent upon other transactions. So instead of a simple update yes or no, but I need to update data in one location and data in another location, only if the two of those succeed has the complete transaction succeeded. Managing that whole thing, we have a coordinator, distributed transaction coordinator. I have a legacy folder with maintenance plans, transformations, some older stuff from SQL Server. And then last but not least, with a little red X on it, is the SQL Server agent. Expanding SQL Server agent, I see things such as jobs, alerts, operators, proxies, and error logs. What's SQL Server agent all about? That's my tool for creating lists of tasks to perform various administrative responsibilities. So using SQL Server agent, I can create jobs, which are a series of tasks to be performed. And then I can have those things run automatically at certain intervals, or maybe just once. I can have alerts fire to tell me the status of a job. Did it succeed? Did it fail? Things of that nature. I can create operators to be notified of the results of those tasks. So lots of things associated with the Microsoft SQL Server agent. So I'll go ahead and close all this down. And now let's talk a little bit about the query interface that's part of the Management Studio. I'm going to click on New Query, and let's maximize our screen real estate. Open that up. And I've got a plain query window here. I've got my properties window with some characteristics of things such as my connection name. If I wanted to change that, I could if I had other connections available. But what I want to focus on now is simply loading a sample database. So we need to grab some files from our CD. So if your CD is not in the drive, go ahead and pop it in. If it is, in the root of your CD, you should have a course files folder. We're going to copy that folder to your hard drive right under the root, under C. I'm going to right click, go to copy. I don't need that now. I can minimize it or get rid of it. Go to Start, My Computer. Go to my C drive, right click, and paste that in. Now, if your box is configured so that you're working on a drive other than C, then you will need to edit the file. Here, I'm going to double click to go to Course Files. Inside of that, I've got folders for the various videos. Currently, videos 4 and 5 are in this one. And I've got a Create Veronica DB and a Load Client Flower Match. If you open up Create Veronica DB, I'll go ahead and double click that. And it populates my new query window. I'm going to scroll down a little. Notice I have some statements here that say bulk insert, and then there's a full path to a CSV file. So notice it's C:\course files video 05. If you decide to put your course file folder on a drive other than C, or change any of the file structure, you'll have to change each one of these bulk inserts. So let's say, for example, you're dealing with a D drive instead of a C drive. You need to change each one of these from C to D. And there are about 5 of those, I believe. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. So I have to update each one of those. But assuming you haven't done it any differently than me, you can click Execute right here. And that'll actually run that SQL and create my Veronica database. Now in my case, I just highlighted something in this file, demonstrating to you. Whenever you do that with SQL, it'll run only what's highlighted. So I don't want it to run just the letter C. So I'll click somewhere else, click on Execute a second time. And this time, the only error I should get will be an error that says you can't drop the Veronica's database because it doesn't exist. And that's totally fine. The first time through, it tries to delete the database before recreating it. That way, if you've played around with it, totally trashed it, it deletes it and recreates it. Well, the first time it doesn't exist. So let's look at my databases. I'll just slide this over a little bit, expand, and I still see the same databases I saw before. But if I right click, there's a refresh option. After the refresh, there's my Veronica's database. I can expand that. I can see the diagrams. I can see the tables. There's the 4 tables we created. Any views I would have created, haven't created any yet. I right click again, and right click is going to definitely be your friend in this process. I get a long list of options, including there's PowerShell again. That's going to show up in a lot of places. And I can do things such as create a new table, redesign a table. I can query the top 1,000 rows automatically, so I can right click that. And it actually generates the SQL and runs it for pulling back the top 1,000 rows from that table. 1,000 or less, depending on how many rows are in the table. Okay? We have various debugging tools. There's a debugger built into SQL Server. starting it, stopping it. There's a parsing tool. I can display estimated execution plans of how long it'll take to run certain types of queries. Other query options available to me. IntelliSense. As we're working inside the query window, it'll automatically pop up some options for you, and you can pick those options from a list. You may like that, you may possibly not like it. You can turn it on or off here. Results to text, results to a grid where you want to put the information when it comes out, results to a file. You've got commenting tools. If you want to comment out several lines of your T-SQL, you can do that here. Or you can then uncomment it, indenting things, decreasing the indent. So lots of different tools right there on the menu. One other thing to show you in here. If I right-click, like I said before, on most objects, I get a nice big menu of options. The very last thing on the list says Properties in most cases. And here, I can get in and reconfigure most of my objects. I have a General page, Permissions page, Change Tracking, and this list is going to vary depending on the object I selected. So by selecting a table, I get one list. Selecting a database, I get a slightly different list. So I get files and file groups. Here are the files that make up my database, the file groups that they're part of, various options for the database. So all your configuration options are available right here in this property interface. We'll play around with that more coming up later. So with that, we've completed our high-level tour of SQL Server 2008, and in the upcoming videos we're going to dive in quite a bit deeper and have a lot of fun in the process of that as well. So let's flip back over to the slides and wrap this up. Well, that about covers it, but then what did we actually cover? We basically gave you a real high-level overview of what are all the buttons in SQL Server 08. I know whenever I start off with a new version of anything from Microsoft, I'm usually pretty eager to say, well, what happens if I click on? What happens if I push? Next, what are some of the new terms that we learned? You know, when I first put this together, my thought was none. And then I said, well, maybe there were a few, such as the concept of a system database. That was a new term, right? So I figured I'd throw that one on there. System databases are databases used by SQL Server to manage itself. It doesn't use INI files or things of that nature to manage data about itself. It saves all that information in a database, which makes sense. And I came up with a few others too. Business intelligence, which we said, is there really such a thing? Well, hopefully there is, but in this particular case, we're saying the science of taking massive amounts of information and applying tools to that information that allow us to make business decisions. And then third, replication. Replication in SQL Server is talking about taking information from a particular database and copying all or part of, typically part of that data, out to other servers so that users at those remote locations near those other servers have a local copy of the data. The benefit of that is reduced traffic across your network. A distributed access to your data usually increases performance, gives you redundancy in the event that networks are down or the primary server is down. They have their own information. And of course, for doing reporting, which is really back to performance again, everybody's not putting a drain on your primary server every time they need to run various reports. And then moving on to the last thing on this list is you should know how to what? Well, at a minimum, you should be able to access several of the SQL Server tools. Mainly the main tools is what I've tried to highlight for now. There's a lot of other buttons on there. I didn't actually show you all of them yet. And to be honest, we may not get to every single button and every single menu before you're done, but you will understand how to use SQL Server to do all the things Microsoft says it can do. And that's a lot. And then last, you should know how to load an existing database using a script and a CSV file. Now, honestly, you're not going to do that real often. That's not a primary task you're going to find yourself doing on a regular basis. But it's something we did in this module, and it's a handy skill. And especially for learning purposes, you may find it necessary to load CSV files. Or just transferring data between databases, you might find it necessary to load CSV files. And it's something we did. So as a result of this video, you can probably feel really comfortable in doing that. Well, that brings us to the end of this video. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video in this series.